So what happens when a journalist, the government, and the future king all go to war over a bunch of secret letters? Well, that's exactly what we're going to untangle today. It's a story about a decade-long legal battle that really shook the British establishment to its core. And it all comes down to this one seemingly simple question. But this question, man, it sparked a huge constitutional clash. We're talking a fight that went all the way to the UK's Supreme Court, really pushing the limits of government power and the public's right to know. Okay, so let's break down how this all went down.
All right, so here's the plan. We're going to start with the memos themselves, then get into the 10-year fight to get them released, the government's crazy veto, the huge showdown that caused, and finally, the big Supreme Court verdict.
Okay, first things first. Before we get into all the legal drama, what were these black spider memos everyone was fighting about?
Yeah, these were not just some casual how-do-you-do notes. This was what's called advocacy correspondence. Basically, these were letters where the heir to the throne, Prince Charles at the time, was trying to directly influence government policy. We're talking about everything from architecture to farming, and that is exactly why they were so controversial.
And of course, they've got this great nickname, the Black Spider Memos. Why? Well, it's pretty simple, actually. It was because of the prince's handwriting. It was this sprawling, spidery black ink. And, that little detail really helped. It made this complicated, abstract legal fight feel much more real and interesting to everybody.
So how did this whole thing kick off? Well, it wasn't some big explosion. It all started pretty quietly, actually, with a single Freedom of Information request from a journalist way back in 2005. And that one request started an absolute epic of a legal battle.
And let me tell you, this was not a quick fight. Not at all. It turned into this multi-year slugfest with wins and losses for both sides. It gets rejected at first, but then the case ends up in front of something called an information tribunal. And in 2012, they dropped a pretty major decision.
So get this, a court had looked at all the evidence and said, yep, the public's right to know is more important here. It really looked like a huge win for transparency. Case closed, right? Well, not so fast. The government had one last trick up its sleeve.
And this, right here, is where the story takes a massive turn. Because the government decided to use a super rare, and let's be honest, a really controversial legal power. Basically, the power to just ignore what the court said.
It's kind of like having a secret trump card. Tucked away in the Freedom of Information Act, there was this rule that let a cabinet minister, the Attorney General in this case, just step in and say nope. They could issue a veto and completely block a ruling they didn't like, even if a court had just made it.
So now you've got this huge standoff. On one side, you have the court saying, release the letters, it's in the public interest. And on the other, the government's veto saying, absolutely not, we have to protect the prince's political neutrality. And see, this wasn't really just about privacy anymore. It was about something much bigger. The government was worried that if people saw the prince lobbying, he'd look like a political figure. And that could seriously damage the whole idea of a neutral monarchy, even before he became king. They were at a complete standstill.
Okay, so that veto, it set the stage for the final showdown. This wasn't just about the letters anymore, not by a long shot. The whole thing was now headed to the UK Supreme Court to answer a massive question. Who really has the final say in the British system?
This is what it all boiled down to. The big question for the Supreme Court was this: can a government minister just overrule a detailed legal judgment from a court simply because they don't agree with it? It's a question that gets right to the heart of how power is supposed to be separated in a democracy.
So you had two very different arguments in front of the court. The journalist's side was saying, look, this veto completely undermines the rule of law. But the government argued back, saying, no, this is a constitutional safeguard. We need it to protect the future king's impartiality. Their point was that a prince who gets involved in politics could threaten the whole stability of the monarchy.
So, after a full decade of legal fighting, countless arguments, and with the constitutional stakes just getting higher and higher, the highest court in the land was finally ready to make its call.
And the verdict? It was decisive. By a vote of 5-2, the Supreme Court justices sided with the journalist. They ruled against the government. The veto was unlawful. So here's the crucial bit, the reason why they ruled that way. The court basically said a minister can't just use this veto because they disagree with a ruling. To overrule a court, you need what they called reasonable grounds, and that is a very high legal standard. The judges decided the Attorney General just didn't have a good enough reason. In a clash of opinions, the court's detailed legal decision had to win. And the fallout from this was huge. I mean, it went way beyond just these letters. This was a landmark decision that limited the government's power.
It reinforced that the rule of law is more important than what a minister just happens to think. And of course, it finally paved the way for those Black Spider memos to be released.
So, the case of the Black Spider memos is officially closed. But it leaves us with this really big and honestly pretty tricky question that we're still dealing with today. In a modern democracy, where exactly do we draw the line between the privacy of public figures and the public's right to know? It's a question about transparency and power that's just as relevant now as it was when this whole thing started.